So with any poem, especially one which is just one long unbroken stanza like this, when you first read through it, it's worthwhile trying to find out what the different sections are. For the scene poetry, you don't get 3 bullet points like you do for the unseen to help you think about the beginning, middle and end. But it's still important for you to do that. So one way to do it is just to roughly divide the poem, or if it's a prose extract, the novel, into 3 sections. You might also be able to find some words that might give you a clue about where there's a slight shift in tone or direction. So with this poem, we can see that there's quite a long opening section where what's described is the general activities and appearance of the cows in the field nearby where the speaker lives. Roughly 2/3 of the way through, we can see a new section introduced with the word but. So that should give you a clue that there's been a slight change in direction. So we go from first impressions and then the summative sentence, how mysterious, how patient and dumbfounded they appear in the long quiet of the afternoon. So that short 2-line sentence is summing up basically the opening third of the poem, all the way from there were a few dozen down to waiting for rain. Then short 2-line sentence summing it up. Now but introduces a new topic. And it introduces a new section of the poem, the middle of the poem, what would be bullet point 2 if this were an unseen poem. So now we want to think about where the third section might come in. And if you skim down the poem again, you can see that at the start of one of the lines, we get a change in direction word, like a signpost when you're going along a road. So we go, there were a few dozen, but every once in a while. And then the last bit I would go for is, then I knew, then I knew. So what we've got here is another direction change. So once we've got that, we can just make a note that we think we can spot roughly 3 sections to the poem. They don't all have to be equal length, but it does help us just to get some ideas about how the main theme is introduced, how it's developed, and then what the final thoughts and feelings are. Now you've got 3 sections, the next thing to do is just think about which details from each section are most important. Something like your top 3 from each section is going to be a good start. If you get 3 top words or phrases from each section of the poem, beginning, middle and end, and then 1 that is your favourite overall, that gives you a top 10 list of quotations for the whole poem. And if you say a couple of things about each quotation, what it denotes or means, what it might imply or suggest, and then another thing it might imply or suggest, that's going to get you 3 points about every single quotation. 1, denotation, 2, connotations, and if you do that for 10 quotations across the whole poem, that adds up to 30 things to say, 30 points about the way the language works in the poem. So that means you've got plenty of chances of making relevant, insightful, detailed, sensitive points to move you up the mark scheme. Contrast that to somebody who might just be quoting once or twice and only saying a couple of insightful comments about each. You've got far more ammo to shoot at the mark scheme. Think of it like that. So find your top 10 and try and say more than one thing about each one. To make it a bit easier to follow through the structure of the poem, let's just take these sections one at a time. So the first one, there were a few dozen who occupied the field across the road from where we lived, stepping all day from tuft to tuft, their big heads down in the soft grass, though I would sometimes pass a window and look out to see the field suddenly empty, as if they had taken wing, flown off to another country. One thing to note about that is that it's a relatively long opening sentence. So we go all the way from there were down to country. The next one goes from then later to rain. And the final one in the first third goes from how mysterious to afternoon. So you can see that the last sentence is much shorter than the other two. This is why initially we said it seems like a summing up of the mood or atmosphere of the opening. So it gives us a clue then about what to expect. We've got the ideas that it is the patience of the cows and their silence that interests the speaker. So they're mysterious to him for this reason. So as we're reading through then the opening images, we want to think about those dominant impressions. The idea that they just step all day from tuft to tuft could imply that they're quite boring. But that initial image is complicated because although it seems like there's a lot of monotony there and repetition because all they do is go from one tuft of grass to the next grazing. He says, though, introducing a slightly more complicated perspective. So they seem to just do the same thing all the time, though. So except, I would sometimes pass a window and look out to see the field suddenly empty. So the idea of suddenness isn't perhaps something we would associate with cows, especially the way they've been described in the opening of the poem, as being there all day, doing the same thing, tuft to tuft. So suddenness means that there's a slight element of complexity or contrast to the opening images. As if they had taken wing, flown off to another country. So this is a very jarring image. As if should signal to you that it's a simile and you need to talk about it as such. So the image is surprising because the idea of a cow being able to take flight is comical in a way, isn't it? Talk about, well, if pigs might fly, similar idea with the cow. It's a heavy, slow, lumbering creature. So the element of surprise, perhaps even humour, is conveyed through the simile. The idea that they go to another country suggests that they're nowhere to be seen. The departure seems to be quite stark. Then later, I would open the blue front door and again the field would be full of their munching. The munching reminds us of the tuft to tuft earlier. So it's really the only thing they do. Or they would be lying down on the black and white maps of their sides, facing in all directions, waiting for rain. We had the simile of taking wing and flying off to another country. So you might make a link between maps and country. Going off to another country suggests travel in different locations, and the image of maps for the patterning on their hides reinforces that. Perhaps the sense of mystery that the speaker notices about them as they're waiting for rain, because cows lie down when they sense that rain is coming. Perhaps that sense of mystery is also involved in what the maps might be of. Do the cows have a kind of intuitive or mystical knowledge of nature that the speaker lacks? So for these reasons, they seem mysterious, patient, and dumbfounded. Now, we haven't had any sounds in the first section, apart from the munching. So this is why, at the end, it's interesting to note, in terms of the way the five senses are appealed to by the poem, that we've got long quiet. We need to remember that when later on there are some sounds introduced that break this quiet. So you might be thinking then what some of the quotations to choose from the first stanza might be, the first section. A top three might be the idea of taking wing, the maps, then you might contrast all day with suddenly, or you might perhaps like to bring in some of the images from the end, like mysterious or patient. But the idea is you need to be selective. You can't talk about every word. So decide what you think the main idea of the opening third is, and then choose the quotations that best convey it. You could argue that one of the main ideas of the first section is the idea of boundaries between the cow and the speaker. So the road is one boundary, and then across the road you get the wall before the field, so that's another boundary. We've also got a window that the speaker looks out of. So roads, walls, windows as well. These are all things that separate the speaker from the cows. They're boundaries or thresholds. So we're thinking about the cow as something on the other side of various boundaries, something separate from the speaker, and therefore perhaps strange. We've also got another type of boundary, which is between species as well, or humans and nature. So it's important when you see some literal physical details like the field, the wall, the window, the road, to think about the theme that they might be there to explore. This is what the mark scheme calls deeper implications. So this poem is starting to look like, because of these boundaries and the idea of the cow being out there or over there in some way, and the emphasis on mystery, it's starting to look like an exploration of an encounter with strangeness. Moving on to the next section, we said that it begins with but, showing that there's been a change in direction. So the previous section ended with the idea of the long quiet. Now though, just as we had tuft to tuft and munching all day, and then suddenly they're gone, now, although we have the long quiet, there's another startling change. But every once in a while, one of them would let out a sound so phenomenal that I would put down the paper or the knife I was cutting an apple with and walk across the road to the stone wall to see which one of them was being torched or pierced through the side with a long spear. So the imagery used to describe the sound that the cow makes is quite vivid and dramatic. Phenomenal means remarkable, even marvelous. So it's something that, again, makes the cows seem mysterious. It's kind of the equivalent of how suddenly they disappeared, as if they'd taken wing. And it makes him stop his work in the kitchen, cutting an apple, or if he's writing, put down the paper, and he goes across the road to the stone wall. We'll talk more about the wall in a second, linking it back to some of the imagery in the previous stanza. There's a lot about boundaries and thresholds and what might be on the other side of the wall and what that represents. But torched and pierced convey ideas about not just pain, but even perhaps torture or extreme suffering. So the sound is very unnerving and disturbing. Yes, it sounded like pain. Yes, it sounded like pain. So that's another interesting contrast, because the beginning of the poem seemed to be about peace, the long quiet of the afternoon. There didn't seem much for the cows to be pained about. They're just munching the grass. So we might not expect there to be a pained noise from them, but there is. And then the speaker notes that when he goes to check, he sees that actually, although it sounds like pain, The one making the noise, anchored there on all fours, and anchored as an image coming from the ship dropping anchor, suggests how firmly fixed or rooted the cow is to the spot, which you might contrast to how they can seem to suddenly disappear, as if they've flown away. Flight and anchors aren't things that you would put together. To fly is the opposite of being anchored. So when he sees her anchored there, with her neck outstretched and her bellowing head labouring upward, as she gave voice to the rising full-bodied cry that began in the darkness of her belly and echoed up through her bowed ribs into her gaping mouth, he realises that actually the cow isn't being torched or pierced. No one's hurting it. Instead, we've got this deep, effortful, which is what labouring tells us, sound emanating from it. And it seems to come right from the depths of the cow. Rising implies that it's coming from somewhere low down. It's full-bodied. So it's a deep expression. The whole cow's got into it. And it begins in the darkness of the belly. And the idea of darkness might create a sense of mystery, perhaps intrigue. The bowels of something is often described as being like the core of it. So this noise that the speaker hears the cow making reveals to him something about the innermost identity of the cow. And it echoes through the ribs. Again, this sense of reverberation, encapsulating all the different aspects of the cow's body. Coming up through the ribs and the heart into the gaping mouth. The idea of gaping suggests how wide the mouth is, and it might get us thinking about the speaker's impressions of what the cry means. What's the cow saying? If we come back to this idea of the wall, because at this moment, the speaker is one side of the wall and the cow is on the other, we can see that there's been a few thresholds or boundaries in the poem so far. That's why, perhaps, the images describing the noise, darkness, for example, and how it first sounds like pain and is almost remarkably strange to him, like he can't quite believe it. That's why this description hints at a sense of mystery. When we move to the last section of the poem, we can see that there's a concluding thought or feeling. So we've had mystery, now we get then I knew, then I knew. So when you see phrases like this, it's worthwhile thinking about what's different at the end of the poem. What has the speaker learnt? What realization has occurred? Then I knew that she was only announcing the large, unadulterated cowness of herself. Cowness is quite an odd word. It's suggesting that what he's encountered here is like the essence of cows in the abstract. So there's a cow and you have individual cows. And when you think about that whole group, you can abstract the concept of cowness, what it means to be a cow. So it's quite comical because the poet is getting philosophical about his encounter with these cows, trying to really pin down what it means. What is a cow? Large and cowness together is also quite funny because large is to do with physical size, whereas cowness is an abstraction. You can't measure cowness. It's not going to be big or small. It's just an idea that you think about. So the two going together is an interesting contrast between the concrete or the particular and the abstract or the general. Unadulterated suggests that there's a kind of purity to it. It's like now listening to this cry coming from deep within the cow, he's been hit with pure cowness, pouring out the ancient apologia of her kind to all the green fields and the grey clouds. Apologia is a literary term for a written justification or defense of oneself. So again, that's quite funny, especially next to cowness, because it means that a formal literary term, apologia, is being applied to the cow's cry. So it sounds like the cow is a kind of philosopher shouting out to the whole world, all the green fields and the grey clouds, a justification for its own existence. We get the sense that this is a very expansive and deep justification because it's pouring out. This implies it is deeply felt, and the listing that it's not just her, but her kind that speaks here, and it's to all the fields and the clouds, so earth and sky, and to the hills and to the sea as well, makes it seem universal. And then the way the poem ends is really interesting because we began with the speaker looking at the cow, but now, and you'll remember that the end of a poem normally gives you the climactic image. Now look at what happens. While she regarded my head and shoulders above the wall, there's that threshold again, with one wild, shocking eye. So when you can, look to the last line of a poem for the clue about what it's really about. This is a poem about watching and looking, eyes. And the speaker starts the poem looking at the cow. The speaker is the watcher. But at the end, he's the one being watched. So the cow looks back over the wall. And in that eye contact between speaker and cow is the meaning of the encounter, is the mystery. Because the poem is just one long 3-verse stanza, people often find it difficult to make points about its structure and form. There's a temptation to give an overall comment like this one. This does make some valid points in terms of how the different sections of the poem are signalled. There were, then, but, yes, then. However, if you think about it, the points made here could apply equally well to an extract of prose. So we haven't really, in this comment, said anything about the structure of the poem as a poem. There's nothing particularly poetic about any of this. It could also be true of prose. And if you get to the end of an essay and you notice that the examiner wouldn't be able to guess whether you have written about a prose extract or a poem, that's generally a bad sign. When writing about poetry, you need to pay attention to the layout on the page. And what makes a poem is what happens at the right-hand margin. In poetry, the right-hand margin is a choice, whereas in prose, that margin is just determined by the size of the font and the width of the page. If you take a poem and you rearrange all the lines so that it is set out like prose, you take away something that is there as an artistic choice by the writer. So let's look instead at a couple of moments where we can say that what happens at the right-hand margin adds to the effect of the poem. Here are some examples of what are called run-on lines. This is where the sentence continues beyond the end of a line. Some people say enjambment instead, using the French term, but that is hard to spell and it's French. So I think using the English run-on line is preferable. But every once in a while, one of them, in this moment here, the space between the two lines, the reader is left waiting to find out what one of them does every once in a while. Because of the way the new image or sentence is introduced, but We're expecting there to be a contrast from what's gone before. And remember, up until this line, we've had the impression of how dumbfounded the cows are and how repetitive and monotonous they are, apart from when every once in a while they seem to vanish as if they've flown away. So we're going from silence to every once in a while something happens. So at this moment, tension goes up as we wait to find out what it is. When the completion of the line comes in, would let out a sound so phenomenal. The word phenomenal suggesting that there's something very remarkable, even marvelous about the noise, heightens the effect of the dramatic pause that the run-on line creates. Similarly, in this example, note that just as before, after them, we're left hanging, thinking, well, what could you see? It sounded like pain until I could see, ... the noisy one, anchored there on all fours. So the line endings, the run-on lines, are used and exploited by the poet for deliberate effect, creating this sense of suspense and tension. If you can comment on how the run-on lines are used in that way, then you are paying closer attention to the effects of the layout of the poem on the page. This is preferable to making overall comments about the fact that it is just one long free verse stanza. It's better to focus on individual details wherever possible. Say a lot about a little rather than a little about a lot. For the scene poems, you normally get words like striking, memorable, significant, or moving in the question. That's similar to the unseen poems. The difference is, though, that with the scene poetry, you don't get any bullet points to help you structure your answer. The reason for that is they assume that you know the poems well enough to be able to think of a main theme or idea for each of the three sections, beginning, middle, and end. If you don't know roughly what you want to say about the beginning, middle, and end of each of the scene poems, then that is something important to learn by the time the exams come around, because it can be quite difficult without any bullet points to actually get your essay started. So they assume that you know them well enough that you don't need bullet points. But if you don't actually know them well enough, then the scene poems can end up being harder than the unseen poems because the question doesn't give you any help. So it's very important that you understand what the main ideas are for each of the scene poems. Once you know what the main word in the question is, in this case striking, make sure that you refer to it very frequently throughout your answer. I think as a rule of thumb, it's worth referring to it once in every single paragraph as a minimum. That way, you're not going to be drifting off task and answering the question that you have in mind rather than the one that's actually on the page. So make sure the examiner can see you're doing exactly what they've asked you to do. Introductions need to be quite short, about 4 to 5 lines long. A common mistake is to go into too much detail in the introduction. So what you want to do is give a quick overview of what happens in the poem and its overall meaning or message and its impact on you. And the best way to do that is to quote from towards the end of the poem, because there you're likely to find an image that sums up its overall mood or atmosphere. So for this one, we've said that the overall shift is from seeing the cows as quite mundane or boring to mysterious. And this is interesting to the poet because it's an exploration of how actually what you take for granted can seem to be quite strange when you really think about it. And what goes on is that normally, because of the habits that you just fall into, you don't really take notice of what's around you. So this means your perceptions can become a bit dulled. You never really see the cows. But when you do look at them, they then become wild. And there's something about really seeing the essence of them, the unadulterated cowness. So the intro gives an overview, explains the impact of the poem on us, and it also starts to think about the deeper implications, choosing a quotation from the end of the poem. You can already see that an intro like this one has made you stand out from the weaker candidates who will just be thinking, what the hell is this poem about? Why is this guy written about some cows? So you're thinking about why the cow is interesting, thinking about what ideas it represents. Then you want topic sentences, which pick up on the ideas that you have introduced at the beginning of your answer. First, focus on the beginning of the poem, then go to the middle, and then the end. It seems straightforward and simplistic even, but actually it's what the examiner's report recommends. They say that the best answers follow the structure and development of the passage. This is better than having a checklist of literary terms where you might write all about the different language techniques coming under repetition in paragraph 1, and then all about the sound effects in paragraph 2, for example. You're much better off just dealing with how the poem develops chronologically. So if in doubt, just go beginning, middle, and end. You can tell that's what they like because that's what they give you when it comes to the unseen poetry. Bullet points for beginning, middle, and end. So stick to that. Make sure that you have the keyword in each topic sentence. So something about striking. Here we've got strikingly or shocking. And then the third one, striking again. This means we're always on topic and focusing on the task. I like there to be a link between the topic sentences if possible, because this makes your response more coherent. So you can see here, I finish paragraph 1 when I've analysed my quotations on mystery, developing. I just link back to it by saying developing this hint of mystery. So there's a subtle link which helps me jump from paragraph 1 to 2. I do the same again when I move from paragraph 2 to 3. I say that they go from being mysterious to then, because of the sudden noise they make, quite shocking to the speaker. And then this shock becomes striking because it makes the speaker reconsider his ideas about the cows. So if you can, build a small bridge between paragraphs 1 and 2 and between 2 and 3. That means it won't just be a disconnected list of ideas. Instead, your argument will have nice clear steps so the examiner can see how you move from one idea to the next. Words like initially, developing, and finally can help signpost the different steps that you are taking. You can see in the boxes that we've just taken some of the main themes or ideas from the introduction and used them to build our paragraphs around. Each topic sentence should really have a theme or idea that your paragraph is going to be about. So I've gone for mundane, but also slightly mysterious by the end of the first section of the poem. Then going from mysterious to more shocking. And then at the end, what is the impact of that shock? Well, he starts to reconsider his ideas about the cows. So you will just need to add about 3 quotations to each of these topic sentences to build your main paragraphs, making sure you've really prioritized which ones are important. Don't fall into the trap of trying to talk about 10 quotations in one paragraph as if they're all equally important. Choose the ones that are most relevant to the question and the points you want to make. The conclusion, like the introduction, is written out here in full, just so we can revise technique. Note that I've made sure I explain the impact on me. So the best answers conclude with an individual evaluation of the impact of the text on the reader. So impact on me is a nice phrase to use, or overall I got the impression of can also work. I've referred back to the word of the question and I'm using it throughout, striking here. I've also chosen a particular detail that I think best sums up the impact. So here, talking about cowness rather than just cow. And I've tried to finish with an idea showing that I can explore the deeper implications of the poem. So what strikes me most is how the encounter with the cow is perhaps a metaphor for man's experience of not only nature, but also the world generally. Looked at attentively, even what we normally take for granted can shock us. So you've got to think carefully about why the poem is interesting. What ideas does it explore? A poem about a cow in a field isn't going to be about just a cow in a field. And that holds true for most of the poems they're going to give you. A poem about a whale, for example, cetacean, isn't really just about whales. For the unseen poetry too, remember that. If you get an animal or some sort of object from nature like a tree, it's probably going to be there to represent certain ideas. So if in doubt, I would say that you should assume it's symbolic. So what ideas might it be representing?
In one of like the given answers that we looked at, it told us like the examiners like review it. He said things that we shouldn't do. And one of them was like don't go off on a tangent. Does that not apply to the conclusion?
By a tangent, what the examiner means there is when you start to get more excited about your own ideas and interpretations than you are about the actual words on the page of the poem. So you can have deeper implications and discuss alternative meanings as long as everything is focused on the words in the poem. So it's very important that you dig deeper and talk about some of the underlying themes, because you can't get the highest marks without doing that. But don't fall into the trap of doing that for a whole page without quoting.